Can we see the presentation?
Yeah, and if I can just say that just to start us off now, as we're talking about contemporary issues in relation to very up-to-date scholarship, now got Luke Williams and Victoria Waite, who are going to talk to us about empire and slavery. Thank you.
Okay, welcome to Empire and Slavery. Vic, you said you wanted to start us off.
Yeah, okay, so we're looking at empire and slavery, but it's such a large topic that we thought would be quite difficult to address every single issue related to it. So we've looked at the schemes of work in our own schools that we're doing placement 1 at, and we found quite a few similarities actually. Not to say this is representative of all schools, but yeah, we decided to break these issues down into 3 areas. So the first is the good or bad debates used in teaching, which leaves very little middle ground or grey areas of morality to be discussed. Secondly, there's a distinct lack of non-white perspective on the matter, and Luke will be focusing on the African perspective, but Indigenous groups should not be ignored. And finally, the language used when teaching slavery needs to be more carefully considered. Next slide, please, Luke. So looking at the good or bad debates that are used, at one of our schools, they focus on empire and then slavery. So in the second lesson, the sequence involves looking at the positives and negatives of the empire. And students are asked to draw this table in their books. So positive impacts on one side, negative impacts on the other. And in the lesson, the teacher puts on a few information slides, which pupils then look at and add these to their table. Next slide, please. So one of the examples is religion. So it's, some people would argue that Christianity was a force for good in the colonies as it taught people how to live in a good way. So putting myself in the position of students, I would answer positive, but with our knowledge, we can see that this is ignorant and quite dismissive of the religious beliefs and practices, religious beliefs and practices beforehand, so Hinduism and Buddhism. It's very problematic to suggest that the followers of other religions did not know how to live in a good way beforehand, in our opinion. So this is one example, but it kind of acts as a paradigm for how the rest of the information slides did look on the PowerPoint. Next slide, please, Luke. So at my school, the inquiry question was, still is, did Britain gain wealth through exploitation or innovation? So for the first half of the lesson sequence, pupils focus on the Industrial Revolution and its consequences. And then for the second half of the lesson sequence, I think it's 5 each, roughly. So they focus on the slave trade and its abolition. So when pupils return to the inquiry question at the end, I thought it was a bit problematic that it kind of gives them the option to dismiss exploitation in favour of the argument that it was innovation. Yeah, it's a bit evasive, quite British-centric, but I'll delve into this a bit more in the next slide. And another issue is the idea of gaining wealth definitely infers that exploitation could have led to a positive. Gaining wealth is not a negative phrase. So slavery could be construed as for the greater good. Next slide, please, Luke. So in a recent CA session, the Tide Runnymede report was brought up, and it says, until the 1960s, the curriculum implicitly supported the merits of empire and remained evasive on the exploitative or violent realities for colonised people. And I think this still slightly rings true, because looking at it from a British perspective will always be slightly evasive. So I think the resolution here is, don't ask pupils whether something is good or bad when there's exploitative or violent realities that should not be overlooked. And with these topics in mind, empire and slavery, they are at their core bad. Perspective is very important here. We should look at the perspective of the subjects. Again, Luke will pick up on this a bit. And it's better to make judgments about the extent of how bad things are, how bad things were for the colonised and enslaved people, rather than was it good or bad. So we decided that with such a legacy, seeing that empire and slavery should probably be taught with our own inquiry questions. But looking at the inquiry question at my school, we tried to think about how we could mesh together the Industrial Revolution and the transatlantic slave trade in a better way. So we thought of replacing the inquiry question with, to what extent did the transatlantic slave trade fuel the Industrial Revolution? So we're looking directly at how slavery provided the raw materials for industrial change and growth. And this leaves no room to, hopefully, leaves no room to overlook the enslaved Africans who had an important role in the British industry. Next slide, Luke.
Okay, so hold on, just before we do move on, I think it's important to mention as well, we're talking about empire and slavery, and then our inquiry question includes something on the Industrial Revolution. And that is because slavery, Industrial Revolution, and empire are three topics that are so intrinsically linked together. And I think it's important, I don't have an answer for this, but for people to consider how these topics are taught in relation to each other. We concluded that maybe you do the first part of the sequence on empire, then the second part on slavery, and have Industrial Revolution either before or after. I mean, with that inquiry question, that would be Industrial Revolution, then slavery, and then put empire in there at a different place or have it as a running theme. It becomes quite difficult to deal with that because then if you're studying empire, Industrial Revolution, and slavery all in the same topic, it becomes such a bloated module and such a large area to teach. But I just thought that was interesting to mention. So perspective. This image is some students' first exposure to Africans in one of our schools. This is the first time they will have encountered it ever. This does not address the issue that Africans, and furthermore blacks, have been taught almost exclusively as oppressed peoples, and it even sort of encourages that belief because this is the first exposure. The next topic they follow is the civil rights movement, and as far as I'm aware, that is the only focus in this one school that they have on black people. Now, the civil rights movement is obviously advancing black rights, but it's also taken from the perspective of black people who are oppressed in one way or another. Once that image has been interpreted by the students, a short background is given on slavery itself. The Egyptians, for example, used slaves to build the pyramids. They go on to talk about Romans. It was not until the 1560s onwards that British merchants, businessmen became involved with the slave trade. And the British would trade these African slaves in return for cotton and sugar, which they could then take back to England. So a couple of things I wanted to mention on this. How to say it? This is sort of like your background information before you actually get into the transatlantic slave trade. So an obvious issue is present within the short introduction. Africans are not treated as people, but rather property. That's the immediate sort of language that Vic will get onto later. And while it's true that slaves were considered property, it is unwise to consider them as without their own lives. The explanations on the origins of slavery are also disconnected from the origins of the transatlantic slave trade, which I found quite problematic. It treats slavery as one megalithic institution that has existed since the dawn of time, for instance, or at least the ancient Egyptians and Romans. But we jump straight from Romans to then Europeans. We jump to, I think it was 1619, when the first set of slaves were started to be shipped over, enslaved peoples, should I say, to the New World. But the transatlantic slave trade was built upon an internal slave system that already existed within Central and Western Africa. So if we're talking about perspective, we need to know about what was going on in Africa before the Europeans arrived and started exploiting this system. On the left is a very difficult to read map. I do have a link here in the PowerPoint, and I'll put it into the chat afterwards. What it shows is the internal networks by which slavery was carried out in Africa. We can see a great deal of connections across the whole continent to then have coastal areas shipping enslaved peoples to various parts of the New World. This map was just by reading it, I think the source I got it from doesn't say the date, but it's once the United States had broken from English control. So this was a bit later on. This was once the slave trade was in full swing, the transatlantic slave trade. None of this internal slavery or system is ever explained. And the reason it's important to understand where slaves came from is because how it sort of, I don't want to say created, but how it created the conditions by which the transatlantic slave trade started. And it's all tied to the pre-existing Central and Western Africa culture that existed at the time. So unlike Europeans who focused on ownership of land for the securing and expansion of their wealth, the African elite on the West Coast focused on owning labor or workers. So this is where slavery came from as an idea within Central and Western Africa. It wasn't about owning land, it was about owning the people who made the production, whereas in Europe, it was about the land that made the production. So owning many slaves made one wealthy in Africa. However, not all peoples from these areas subscribed to the idea of slavery. There were many congregations or villages that rejected slavery. And of course, these were probably later attacked by the African groups that were endorsing slavery and engaging in heavy trade with the Europeans. And it's not a large leap to see how Europeans witnessed that slaves equaled wealth and soon adopted the system. But you have to be really careful explaining this sort of stuff. We are giving a perspective on where slavery came from. We are not excusing European exploitation of the slave system that existed beforehand. So one can soon find arguments to be made that excuse the transatlantic slave trade because Africans did it first or Africans did it to their own. This is horrifically sort of underexplained, and you have to very, very carefully explain what the situation in Africa before you get to this. There was evidence that enslaved peoples within the African societies were not always deprived of such things as opportunity for freedom, seeing their families, or having legal rights. Race had no factor in African slavery as well, and so you have to treat it carefully in that way. And it should also be explained that the slave trade created new and powerful incentives for the expansion of the pre-existing slavery that took place in Africa. Europeans did not create the system, but they exploited it and caused it to grow. So how do we deal with perspective in some ways? Well, one way many schools appear to be dealing with the inclusion of history that does not portray groups like Africans as simply oppressed peoples is through the study of topics such as Mansa Musa. The school that was doing these topics, they have currently, as I said, just the slave trade, and then they have the civil rights movement. Mansa Musa will be introduced next year, and they are working towards that more inclusive Black history. An alternative to this is to include the context of the African situation as discussed before leaping into the issue of slavery. At university, we took a different approach, and it was the approach of the Atlantic world. So it was Europeans who first crossed the Atlantic and then bound its societies into a common network of exchanges through Africans, though Africans would be dominant numerically in transatlantic migration. Contact with foreign ideas and cultures led to these separate societies adapting and changing themselves, contributing to the changes that occurred in the other societies also. Including sources to history. So just to discuss that, it's not about learning about the empire or the African people who were enslaved or anything like that. It's about the system that was created through the connections of these people. If British people were coming down to Africa, trading for slaves, going to the New World, trading for goods, and returning to Britain, those systems are so intrinsically linked that we cannot see it as exclusively empire, exclusively industrial revolution, exclusively slavery. They are all so heavily connected that it is one of its own system. So I wanted to touch on including sources when we're talking about perspective as well. Getting early African perspectives on the slave trade is pretty difficult. Whether or not that's because they haven't been translated yet or are not widely available is kind of unclear. But one source that was included in the sequence of lessons was, and I will probably butcher the name, but Alauda Equiano, and they were captured and sold as a slave, and he wrote the following passage in a book. That's the only information they give him. And considering provenance is such a huge factor in the way that history is taught in my school, I found it quite interesting that not a lot of information was given on this person. And he was an abolitionist, which I think to know that is quite important, knowing that they are both Black and an abolitionist, an ex-slave, and they died in the late 18th century. So that kind of gives us a rough timeline. And it's important to study the system as it existed rather than how we would see it from the present. One way to do this would be through the study of the Atlantic world, like I said, which takes the Atlantic Ocean and the systems within as their basis of study rather than a single nation. Within schools, this could be quite hard. Just due to the size of the Atlantic system, you want a manageable unit with which to work. However, the inclusion of African perspectives and, of course, indigenous peoples in America allows for this development of the idea of a bigger system that was going on. You know, not every African that was West and Central African that was come into contact with was an enslaved person. When the Europeans first met the Africans, they admired the wealth that they had, and they thought they were fascinating and wonderful people. And it was only through the transatlantic slave trade that those relationships changed. And it wasn't pre-existing slavery that created those relationships either. So I just thought that was interesting. To conclude my portion, it's clear that perspective is largely ignored in some schools or is handled with less than stellar care. People created systems and continue to create them to this day. In order to understand slavery and the history of it, we must see it through many eyes. Hopefully these thoughts have offered some perspective on the matter of how to teach this going forwards. And I will certainly be mindful of such things in my future.
Yeah, just to finish up with, we looked intensely at the words used in our schemes of work and the presentations at our schools. And these words are actually used in textbooks as well, so it's not school's fault. So slave is used a lot, and slave is a very dehumanizing word and can infer that Africans were consenting to the process of slavery. Africa is often used. Africa is often described as a single homogeneous country rather than a continent of great contrasts. And there's also a very different Islamic slave trade operating from East Africa. And the slave trade, so there's been many different slave trades throughout the course of history. So quite problematic. Next slide, please, Luke.
Yep.
So what do we replace these words with? Enslaved person rather than slave. This illustrates that Africans were subjugated to the process of slavery. So it'll help to reiterate the fact that people were being treated like property. West Africa or African countries rather than Africa. So being specific when referring to transatlantic slave trade, and where possible specifying countries and states. This will help to clarify the aspects of history being addressed, and using transatlantic slave trade rather than just the slave trade. So when referring to the forced deportation of African people across the Atlantic, be specific in describing it as the transatlantic slave trade, as this will reinforce the distinctions between this and other periods in slavery.
Yeah, and then just a couple of sources to go deeper into that idea of the Atlantic world that I discussed. If schools do have, and the curriculum does have, an interest in the British aspects, so you could study the British Atlantic world to kind of narrow your view on the matter. However, even that doesn't ignore a lot of groups. Anyway, thank you for listening. I can't remember how to get back to Zoom. Oh, there we go. So I suppose open to any questions if people have them.
Fantastic, thank you. I think you're, just while people think about your questions, I think you're taking a part of the problematic way which we have taught in the past in relation to binary judgments is really, really appropriate, because I think we're all realising that has underplayed the complexity. We've left students without enough knowledge to make judgments which are then highly colonised as opposed to decolonised, and I think you hit that nail on the head very effectively for us. And likewise, in relation to the language that we have used unthinkingly in the past and need to not use, such as slaves as opposed to enslaved people. I think another interesting point you drew out very strongly was the idea of the understanding of providence, because that gets right into the very important things in our modern world in relation to the nature of evidence and the quality of evidence, the status of evidence we are using based on the source material, and actually by knowing more about the provenance, we can better help students to understand how judgments are made. And just to develop further a little bit, maybe before we get into questions, your point about meetings of Africans and Europeans. Again, I think there's something about the British perspective on our own continent, because if one is from Spain or Italy, then the concept of African and European connection is, well, it's an obvious thing because it's the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, and since for more time in human connection than not, transport has been better by sea than by land, anybody living in Southern Europe has had far more connection with Africa than they've ever had with Northern Europe. So it's a very Northern European perspective, but one in which itself is quite blinkered, because for example, sitting in this city, our Jorvik Viking ancestors had plenty of connections down to Africa, and of course the Normans were down in Sicily, which again is just but a very short looping off point to Africa. So I think we can underestimate the extent of pre-connection before this transatlantic slavery period as well. So I think you've got that really strongly. Any questions that anybody wants to put at this point, or shall I stop and then we'll do more questions? Anybody want to do a question at this point?